The tiny black velvet box on my dresser was wide open, but the sparkling diamond ring Garrett had spent 8 agonizing months saving for was gone. In its place was nothing but empty silk, still smelling faintly of my mother's cheap lavender hand cream. That was the exact moment my heart shattered into a million pieces, realizing that the woman who gave me life had just stolen my only ticket out of it. My name is Zalie, and this is the story of how a single promise was tested by the people who were supposed to love us the most. Just 3 days ago, everything felt so beautifully different. I was sitting in Garrett's battered old sedan by the river while the rain beat a steady, soothing rhythm against the windshield. Garrett was a proud guy, but he carried this deep, quiet insecurity because he only made minimum wage as a mechanic. His hands, permanently stained with motor oil, were shaking nervously when he pulled out that modest silver band. "I know it's not some big, flashy rock, Zalie," he had whispered, his eyes desperately searching mine for approval, raw and vulnerable. "But I skipped meals and pulled double shifts for 8 months to buy this. I wanted to show you and myself that I can take care of you. This ring is not just metal, Zalie. It's a promise that we are going to build a peaceful life together, far away from all this chaos." I loved him so much for it. His words felt like a warm blanket over my shivering soul. For 19 years, my life with my mother, Evelyn, had been a nightmare of unpaid bills and eviction notices. Yet, looking at the empty box now, the pain was unbearable. I went to sleep last night with that beautiful promise wrapping around my heart, having no idea that while I was dreaming of our future, my own mother was standing over my bed in the dark, staring at my hand with a desperate, terrible plan already spinning in her mind. My hands shook so violently that I dropped the empty velvet box back onto the dresser. The soft thud it made against the wood felt like a final blow. I stood frozen in the center of my bedroom, my chest tight, trying to convince myself that I was just having a terrible nightmare. But the lingering scent of lavender in the air was too real, too suffocating. I rushed out of my room and began searching the apartment like a wild animal. I checked under the sofa cushions, inside the kitchen cabinets, and even in the trash can, praying that I had just been careless and misplaced it. But deep down, I knew the truth. "Evelyn," I called out, my voice cracking. I never called her Mom when she was like this. There was no answer. The apartment was dead silent, save for the hum of our ancient, leaking refrigerator. I walked into the kitchen and saw her sitting quietly at the small wooden table. The morning sun was streaming through the dirty window, hitting her face, but she didn't blink. She was just sitting there, slowly rubbing her worn hands together, applying a fresh layer of her cheap lavender cream. I stood in the doorway, my breathing heavy, staring at her back. "Where is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence of the room. Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't turn around to look at me. She just kept massaging her hands, her movements slow and deliberate. "I don't know what you're talking about, Zalie," she said quietly, her voice flat, completely devoid of any emotion. "You're always losing things. You probably dropped it somewhere." Her denial was like a cold splash of water, instantly melting my shock into a burning, painful anger. I walked closer to the table, my heart pounding against my ribs, determined to look her in the eyes and force her to face what she had done to my future. "I didn't lose it, Evelyn," I said, my voice trembling as I stepped closer to the table. "I smelled your cream inside the empty box. It's on your hands right now." At those words, her hands finally froze. For a long, agonizing second, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the wall clock. Evelyn slowly turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark circles, and she looked so incredibly tired. "The landlord was here yesterday while you were at work, Zalie," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He said if we didn't have the rent by this morning, our things would be on the sidewalk. I didn't have a choice." "So you took my engagement ring." A tear slipped down my cheek, hot and bitter. "Garrett saved for 8 months for that. It was our promise to get out of this place." Evelyn looked down at her lap, her shoulders slumping. "I pawned it at Vance's. He gave me $300. It paid the rent." The anger in my chest suddenly collided with a heavy, painful memory. I was 10 years old, freezing in our apartment, crying because I didn't have a proper school uniform and the other kids laughed at me. That night, Evelyn had quietly gone out and returned with a brand new uniform. It was only years later that I realized she had sold her grandmother's gold locket, the only beautiful thing she owned, to buy it. She had sacrificed her past for my childhood, and now she had sacrificed my future just to keep a roof over our heads. The realization made the betrayal hurt 10 times worse. She wasn't a monster, she was just a broken woman systematically crushed by life. I can't do this anymore, I whispered, backing away from her. I can't keep drowning with you. I turned around and ran back to my room, grabbing my phone with slippery, sweat-slicked hands to call Garrett. My hands were shaking so much I could barely unlock my phone. When Garrett answered on the second ring, his cheerful, tired voice made my throat tight. Hey Zalie, I just finished my shift. I was thinking about coming over. Garrett, I choked out, the name catching in my throat like a sob. The line went quiet for a second. Zalie, what's wrong, are you okay? It's the ring, I whispered, holding my hand over my mouth to keep from crying out loud. It's gone, my mother, she took it. She pawned it to pay the landlord. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. I could hear the distant clanking of metal from the garage where he worked, but Garrett didn't say a word. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud or angry. It was dangerously quiet, filled with a raw, bleeding humiliation. $300, Garrett said, his voice flat. She sold my 8 months of skipping meals and pulling double shifts for $300. Garrett, I am so sorry. I'll be there in 5 minutes, he interrupted, and the line went dead. When Garrett arrived, he didn't even knock. He pushed the door open, his grease-stained mechanic shirt still on, his face pale and tight with an overwhelming sense of defeat. He looked at Evelyn, who was still sitting silently at the kitchen table, but he didn't scream at her. He just looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and insecurity. Pack your things, Zalie, Garrett said, his voice trembling as he stood in the small living room. I told you that ring was a promise that we were going to build a peaceful life together. If we stay here, we'll never have one. Pack your bags, we are leaving. Without looking back at my mother, I went into my room and grabbed whatever I could fit into a single duffel bag, leaving my old life behind in the dust. The bell above the door of Vance's pawn shop let out a sharp, metallic clang as Garrett and I stepped inside. The air was thick with the musty smell of old dust, brass, and forgotten stories. Behind the scratched glass counter sat Mr. Vance, a man with thinning gray hair and cold, calculating eyes that had seen every kind of desperation this town had to offer. Garrett didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the counter and slammed $300 bills onto the glass. The paper was crumpled, saved from his secret envelope in his car. I'm here for the silver engagement ring Evelyn brought in yesterday, Garrett said, his voice tight, trying to hold onto his dignity. Here's the money she was given. Give me back the ring. Mr. Vance didn't even look at the cash. He slowly took off his reading glasses and leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on the counter. Evelyn's girl, right? Vance asked, looking at me before turning his gaze back to Garrett. You're too late, son. Well, almost too late. My heart stopped. What do you mean? She just brought it in yesterday. Legally, I have to hold items for 30 days, Vance explained, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy. But early this morning, another customer saw it in the back. He liked the vintage cut of the metal. He's already put down a deposit to secure it. In 30 days, when the hold expires, the title transfers to him. He's paying $600 for it. Garrett's jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth would break. It's not yours to sell, it belongs to her. It belongs to the shop now, Vance said, sliding Garrett's $300 back toward him. If you want to break the deposit contract and take it home today, you have to match the full price plus the penalty. $600. And you have exactly 30 days to bring me the rest, or it's gone forever. The 30-day clock began ticking, its heavy rhythm echoing in every silent corner of our lives. Garrett and I moved into a tiny, drafty room above a local bakery, where the smell of yeast and sweet sugar did nothing to cover the sour taste of our desperation. To make up the extra $300, we threw ourselves into a brutal routine. Garrett took on the night shifts at the garage, his body constantly smelling of rust and heavy engine oil, while I started working double shifts at a diner on the highway. We became like two ghosts passing in the night, our interactions reduced to tired nods and soft whispers. We were so physically exhausted that the warm, comforting space we used to share was replaced by a heavy, hollow silence. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would reach out to touch his face, but his skin felt cold, hardened by the stress of our reality. I would look at my bare left hand in the dim moonlight, feeling a deep ache where the ring used to sit. The promise felt like it was slipping away, not because we didn't love each other, but because the weight of the world was slowly crushing the life out of us. On the 11th day, the rain returned, washing the streets in a dull gray light. I was wiping down the counter at the diner, staring out the window, when I saw a familiar figure standing under the leaky awning of the grocery store across the street. It was Evelyn. She looked smaller than I remembered, her shoulders hunched against the damp chill, wrapped in a faded coat that seemed too big for her now. As she turned to walk away, her foot caught on the edge of a wet cardboard box, and she stumbled. Her worn plastic bag tore open, spilling her few belongings onto the wet pavement. I rushed out of the diner, my heart in my throat, but by the time I crossed the street, she was already scrambling to pick up her things. She didn't see me. I watched from a distance as she hurriedly scooped up a few loose items, but in her rush, she missed two small, amber plastic bottles that had rolled into the gutter. When her fragile figure disappeared around the corner, I walked over and picked them up. They were empty medicine bottles, the prescription labels completely torn off, leaving only a sticky white residue. My mind raced with a strange, unsettling confusion. If she had used my ring money just to pay the rent, why was she carrying these secret, nameless bottles, and why did she look like she was fading away? The mystery of those bottles haunted me, but the harsh reality of the pawn shop deadline kept pushing it to the back of my mind. 2 days later, while sitting in the break room at Garrett's garage waiting for his shift to end, I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Garrett's boss, Mr. Henderson, was talking to another mechanic. He was holding a small piece of paper, the receipt from Vance's pawn shop. "My girl has been begging for a vintage silver band for her 18th birthday," Henderson was saying, his rough voice unusually soft. "Found one at Vance's. It's perfect. Simple, elegant, looks like it has a history." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Henderson wasn't some cruel, wealthy tycoon trying to ruin our lives. He was just a tired, hardworking father who wanted to give his daughter something beautiful. It made the situation infinitely worse. How could Garrett beg his boss to give the ring back when Henderson had legally placed a deposit on it? If we tried to fight him, Garrett would lose his job, and if he lost his job, we would lose everything. The trap we were in felt tighter and more suffocating than ever, and I knew the truth would tear Garrett apart. When I finally told Garrett about his boss, the fragile piece we had been clinging to shattered completely. We were standing in our tiny room, the heat from the bakery below making the air thick and stifling. Garrett's eyes went wide, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of our small table. "Henderson," he whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of disbelief and utter humiliation. "The man who decides if I can buy groceries next week is the one taking my promise to you." He slammed his fist against the wall, a sudden, violent burst of frustration that made me flinch. "I can't even buy you a ring without my poverty being thrown in my face." I tried to touch his arm to pull him close, but he pushed my hand away, his chest heaving. "Don't, Zalie," he choked out, tears of anger and shame finally spilling down his grease-smudged cheeks. "Every time I look at your empty finger, I feel like a failure. And now I have to go to work tomorrow, look my boss in the eye, and pretend I'm not drowning." For the first time, the quiet space between us felt like an ocean. The ring had become a heavy anchor, pulling us down into a dark place where love was no longer enough to keep us afloat. The tension followed us into the next week, but my worry for Evelyn wouldn't let me rest. Unable to shake the image of those empty medicine bottles, I finally walked back to my old apartment on a quiet, overcast afternoon. I used my spare key to open the door, expecting a cold silence or an angry confrontation. Instead, a faint, rhythmic coughing sound drew me toward the back bedroom. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was freezing, the heat turned off to save money. Evelyn was lying on her bed, fully dressed under 3 thin blankets, her face pale and shivering. On the bedside table sat a new, unlabeled bottle of pills, next to a half-empty glass of cloudy water. She looked up at me, her eyes glassy with fever, but she didn't say a word. She just reached for her cheap lavender cream and began rubbing it onto her trembling, swollen hands with weak, desperate strokes. I walked over, my anger completely evaporating, replaced by a cold, numbing dread. I picked up the medical papers lying beside her pillow. The words blurred before my eyes, but the diagnosis was clear. My mother wasn't just struggling to pay the rent, she was desperately sick, and the $300 from my ring hadn't gone to the landlord. It had bought her another month of medicine just to stay alive. The freezing air in my mother's bedroom felt like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest as I stared at the diagnosis papers in my hand. Evelyn lay quiet, her breathing shallow, smelling of old wool and cheap lavender cream. But my heart was pounding for Garrett. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of telling him made my stomach churn with a cold, sharp dread. When I walked back to our tiny room above the bakery, Garrett was already sitting on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at his oil-stained work boots. The silence between us was so thick it felt hard to breathe. I sat down beside him, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. "Garrett," I whispered, my voice barely cracking through the quiet room. "I went to see my mother. She didn't pawn the ring for the rent. She's really sick, Garrett." The $300 bought her another month of heart medication. She was dying, and she didn't want to tell me. Garrett didn't move for a long time. His shoulders slumped, and a deep, ragged sigh escaped his lips. The anger that had been stiffening his posture for days slowly drained away, leaving only a profound, exhausted sadness. "So there's no bad guy," he said quietly, his voice hollow as he stared at the floor. "Just us, drowning in a hole we didn't dig. And now my boss is giving that same ring to his daughter in 2 weeks." He stood up, his face pale but determined. "I'll talk to him tomorrow, Zalie. I'll ask Mr. Henderson to let us buy it back, even if I have to beg him on my knees. I'll work for free for a month. I'll do whatever it takes to keep my promise to you." The morning sun felt cold and sharp as Garrett walked into the garage, his boots dragging against the gravel. I sat at my corner table at the diner across the street, my hands wrapped around a mug of hot coffee, watching the garage doors rise through the steam. I knew what he was doing in there. He was swallowing every ounce of his pride, stepping into Mr. Henderson's small, paper-cluttered office with a heavy heart and a trembling voice. Through the diner window, I could see the silhouette of Garrett standing before his boss. Minutes felt like agonizing hours. When Garrett finally emerged, he didn't look at the other mechanics. He walked straight across the street, his face pale, his eyes hollow and dry. He slid into the booth across from me and stared down at the laminate table. "He said no, didn't he?" I whispered, my voice thick with a sudden, sharp ache. Garrett let out a dry, humorless laugh. "He didn't yell, Zalie. That's what hurts the most. He just looked at me with this pity in his eyes. He said his daughter has been staring at that vintage design in Vance's window for months. He already paid the deposit, and he's not going to break his little girl's heart for his mechanic's relationship issues." He clutched his head in his hands, his fingers digging into his hair. I felt so small, Zalie. I stood there begging a man who pays me minimum wage, and he looked at me like I was a child asking for a toy. "He told me to just buy you a new one next year, as if a promise can just be replaced like a broken car part." I reached across the table, gently pulling his rough, oil-stained hands away from his face. "We still have 18 days, Garrett. We are going to find a way. We aren't giving up on us." 18 days became 12, and then, before we could even catch our breath, we were down to the final 5 days. The physical toll of our double shifts was starting to show on our bodies. My legs felt like lead every night when I walked home from the diner, and Garrett's eyes were constantly bloodshot, his hands trembling slightly from the sheer volume of hours he was pulling at the garage. We had pooled every single dollar we could find. We skipped meals, turned off the small heater in our drafty room, and counted every penny from my tip jar. But the math was cold and merciless. 450, Garrett whispered one night, dumping the wrinkled bills and loose coins onto our bed. He counted them 3 times, his fingers slow and clumsy from exhaustion. "We're still $150 short, Zalie. The deadline is in 48 hours. On Thursday morning, Vance legally transfers the title to Henderson." I sat beside him, staring at the small pile of money. $150 felt like a million to us. We had already begged everyone we knew. Garrett's coworkers at the garage were just as broke as we were, and my few friends from school had long since moved away or had nothing to spare. I looked at my bare ring finger, the skin there feeling strangely cold and exposed. It wasn't about the silver or the tiny diamond anymore. It was about our survival. It felt like if we lost this ring, the heavy, dark current of our poverty would finally pull us under for good, proving to both of us that people like us weren't allowed to have beautiful promises. There has to be another way, I whispered, but my voice sounded hollow, even to me, as the last few grains of sand slipped through our fingers. On the final morning before the deadline, the rain stopped, leaving the town wrapped in a heavy, cold fog. I walked back to my mother's apartment, my chest tight with a quiet defeat. I wanted to see her, to make sure she was taking the medication she had bought with our future, even if the silence between us was still too heavy to break. When I pushed open the creaking front door, the apartment was completely quiet. But something was missing. I stood in the hallway, staring into the small dining corner. The heavy oak table where my mother's vintage Singer sewing machine usually sat was completely bare. That machine was the only valuable thing she had left. It belonged to her grandmother, and she had used it for 30 years to patch our clothes and sew small alterations for neighbors to buy our groceries. It was her identity, her final line of defense against the world. "Evelyn," I whispered, walking slowly into the room. My mother was standing by the window, her back to me. She didn't turn around, but her shoulders looked incredibly small. She quietly pointed to the kitchen table. There, sitting next to a half-used bottle of her cheap lavender hand cream, was a small envelope. I walked over with trembling hands and opened it. Inside were 3 crisp $50 bills, $150, exactly what we needed. I looked up at her, my throat tight, tears burning my eyes. "Evelyn, your machine, how will you work?" Evelyn still didn't face me. She just slowly rubbed her thin, worn hands together, applying a tiny drop of her lavender cream. "Your grandmother told me that a mother's hands are meant to build, Zalie, not to destroy," she whispered, her voice cracking with a quiet, dignified pain. "Take it, go buy your promise back." There was no big speech, no begging for forgiveness, just a quiet, heartbreaking sacrifice that spoke louder than any words ever could. The heavy wooden door of Vance's pawn shop felt heavier than ever as Garrett and I pushed it open. The brass bell above us gave its familiar, sharp clang, cutting through the dusty silence of the shop. Behind the glass counter, Mr. Vance was already wrapping a small cardboard box in shiny blue paper, a birthday ribbon sitting next to it. My heart did a violent flip. That was the wrapping for Mr. Henderson's daughter. Garrett stepped forward, his boots leaving damp prints on the floor. He didn't say a word. With a calm, deliberate slowness, he placed our crumpled pile of hard-earned bills on the glass counter, and then, right on top of them, he laid my mother's 3 crisp $50 bills. $600, Garrett said, his voice steady, carrying a quiet pride that hadn't been there for weeks. "We are here for Zalie's ring." Mr. Vance stared at the money. He looked at the blue wrapping paper, then back at us. For a second I thought he might make an excuse, but the law was the law, and the full amount was sitting right in front of him before the clock struck noon. Slowly, he slid the blue paper aside, reached into the drawer, and pulled out the small, black velvet box. He slid it across the glass. Garrett's hands were shaking as he picked up the box and opened it. The modest silver band caught the dim shop light, shining like a beacon of hope. He turned to me, his eyes brimming with tears, and gently took my left hand. As he slid the ring back onto my finger, the metal felt cold, but my heart felt instantly warm. "Zalie," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "This is not just a piece of jewelry. It is the proof that we can survive anything as long as we fight together." The promise never broke. The weight of the silver band on my finger felt different this time. It wasn't just a symbol of a dream anymore. It was a physical testament to the heavy scars we had all gathered along the way. As Garrett and I walked out of the pawn shop, the cool afternoon breeze rushed over us, but the usual rush of victory didn't come. Instead, a quiet, lingering sadness settled in my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about the empty space in my mother's dining corner where her vintage sewing machine used to sit. Garrett held my hand tightly, his thumb gently rubbing over the polished silver. He looked at me, his eyes softer than they had been in weeks, but he could read the shadow on my face. "We got it back, Zalie," he said softly, stopping us on the sidewalk. "So why do you look like we just lost?" "My mother sold her livelihood for this, Garrett," I whispered, looking down at the pavement. "Without that sewing machine, she has no way to make a living. She has no way to buy her groceries or her medicine when this batch runs out. We saved our promise, but at what cost? Garrett's expression shifted, a deep, thoughtful look crossing his face. The pride of reclaiming the ring was slowly meeting the reality of what it had taken. He looked back down at my hand, then out toward the highway where his garage stood. "He did it because she loves you, Zalie," Garrett said quietly, his voice thick with a sudden maturity. "And we are not going to let her sacrifice be in vain. We are going to find a way to make things right with her. The promise was always about building a family, and she is a part of that, whether we like it or not." He pulled me into a gentle, protective hug, and for the first time, the future didn't just feel like an escape. It felt like a responsibility we were finally ready to carry together. We walked back to my mother's apartment together, our hands still clasped tightly. The air inside the drafty hallway felt less suffocating this time, as if the truth had finally cleared away the toxic fog of secrets and resentment. When I unlocked the door, the silence of the apartment greeted us, but it was no longer the heavy, hostile quiet of before. It was just a tired home, waiting. Evelyn was sitting on her small bed, staring at her hands. The empty space in the dining corner where the sewing machine once stood seemed to cast a long, painful shadow across the room. Hearing our footsteps, she looked up, her pale face tightening with an immediate defensive worry. She looked at Garrett, expecting the anger, the blame, or the bitter words that had defined their relationship for so long. Instead, Garrett walked right up to her bedside. He didn't say a word at first. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his heavy, oil-stained mechanic's keys, placing them gently on her bedside table. "I'm selling my sedan, Evelyn," Garrett said, his voice quiet but remarkably steady. "It's old and it leaks, but a guy at the garage offered me $500 for it last week. We're going to use that money to buy your Singer sewing machine back from the pawn shop tomorrow." My breath caught in my throat. I looked at Garrett, my eyes wide with disbelief. That car was his pride, his only independent possession, the vehicle that was supposed to carry us away to our new life. "Garrett, no," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling as she stared at the keys. "You need that car, it was your way out." "No," Garrett said gently, kneeling down so he was at eye level with her. "Our way out is together. You gave up your livelihood to save my promise to Zalie. The least I can do is give up a piece of metal to save yours." For the first time since I could remember, my mother didn't push us away or hide behind her cold, defensive wall. She stared at the heavy metal key ring on her bedside table, her lips trembling. Slowly, she reached out and touched Garrett's hand, not with the desperate grip of someone drowning, but with a soft, trembling gratitude. The faint scent of lavender cream rose between them, no longer a trigger of betrayal, but a gentle reminder of a mother's quiet survival. "You are a good man, Garrett," Evelyn whispered, tears finally escaping her tired eyes and rolling down her hollow cheeks. I didn't think anyone would ever fight for us like this." "We are a family now, Evelyn," Garrett replied softly, his voice thick with emotion as he squeezed her worn hand. "Family doesn't leave each other behind in the dark. We pull each other out." I walked over and sat on the edge of the bed beside them, wrapping my arms around my mother's frail shoulders. For 19 years, I had felt like she was an anchor dragging me down into the deep, cold water of our poverty. But in this quiet room, holding both her and the man who loved me, I finally understood. She wasn't an anchor, she was just a tired swimmer who had been keeping my head above water for as long as she could, even when her own lungs were bursting. Together, sitting on that small, cold bed, we made a quiet pact. We weren't going to run away from our problems anymore. We were going to face them, piece by piece, starting with the old sedan and the vintage Singer sewing machine. We were going to heal, not just escape. The next morning, the garage across the street was bustling with the loud, metallic clatter of wrenches and the heavy hum of engines. Garrett walked in with a quiet, calm determination, holding the title to his battered old sedan. I stood by the door, watching him hand the keys over to Bobby, the mechanic who had been eyeing the car for months. Bobby counted out 5 crisp $100 bills, slapping them into Garrett's grease-stained hand with a grin. Garrett didn't look back at the empty parking space where his car had sat for the last 3 years. He walked straight back to me, the money held tightly in his fist, a bright, beautiful spark of hope in his eyes. "Let's go get her machine back," he said, pulling me close. We walked into Vance's pawn shop for the second time in 24 hours. Mr. Vance looked up from his ledger, his gray eyebrows raising in genuine surprise as we walked toward the counter. He hadn't expected to see us again so soon, let alone with more cash. I need to buy back Evelyn's Singer sewing machine, Garrett said, placing the $500 onto the glass counter. The one she brought in last week. Mr. Vance stared at the money, then at our determined faces. He let out a slow, respectful sigh. Without saying a word, he walked into the cluttered back room and emerged a minute later carrying the heavy, cast-iron vintage machine. He set it on the counter with a loud, metallic thud. "You kids are stubborn," Vance murmured, sliding the receipt over. "But I've got to respect it. Take it home." As Garrett lifted the heavy machine, I touched the polished wood of its base. It felt warm, like a piece of our history was finally being restored to where it belonged. The heavy iron sewing machine sat proudly back on the oak table in the corner of our apartment, its brass wheels catching the warm afternoon light. Evelyn sat before it, her thin fingers gently running over the familiar metal body. For the first time in months, her breathing was steady, and the deep, hollow exhaustion in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, peaceful focus. The rhythmic, soothing hum of the needle piercing through fabric filled the small apartment, a beautiful melody of healing and hard work. Garrett stood beside me, his arm wrapped tightly around my waist. Without his car, we now walked everywhere together, our boots clicking in unison on the cracked pavement. It was a slower life, a harder life, but it was ours. "We did it, Zalie," Garrett whispered, leaning down to press a soft kiss against my temple. "We kept the promise." I looked down at the silver band on my left hand, its modest diamond sparkling against the golden afternoon light filtering through the window. It wasn't just a ring anymore. It was the quiet strength of three people who refused to let poverty break them. "Yes, we did," I murmured, leaning my head against his shoulder as the steady, comforting hum of my mother's sewing machine played on, stitching our lives back together, one beautiful thread at a time. 6 months passed, and the bitter winter fog that had once choked our small town slowly melted into the soft, golden warmth of late summer. The change in the weather seemed to mirror the quiet transformation inside our lives. The heavy, dark cloud of desperation that used to hang over our apartment had vanished, replaced by a steady, comforting rhythm. In the corner of our dining room, the vintage Singer sewing machine was no longer a symbol of sacrifice. It was a beacon of new beginnings. Evelyn sat there in the afternoon light, her face looking fuller and healthier than it had in years. The heart medication was doing its job, but the real healing had come from the sense of purpose she had found. She had started a small alteration business from home, mending dresses for the local school teachers and designing simple, beautiful curtains for the neighbors. The rhythmic, soothing tap-tap-tap of the needle was the soundtrack of our afternoons. "Zalie, hand me the blue thread, please," Evelyn murmured, not looking up from her work, a gentle smile playing on her lips. I smiled, handing her the spool. I looked at her hands. They were still worn, but they no longer trembled with the fear of tomorrow. She was no longer a burden to us, and we were no longer a burden to her. We had stitched our fractured family back together, one small thread at a time. Garrett entered the apartment a few minutes later, his forehead damp with sweat from his walk from the garage, but his eyes were bright. Without his car, he had walked miles every single day, but his posture was no longer slumped. He looked strong, proud, and completely at peace. He caught my eye, and the simple, unspoken understanding between us felt stronger than any words we had ever spoken. Garrett dropped his heavy canvas work bag by the door and walked over to my mother, gently placing a warm hand on her shoulder. Evelyn stopped her sewing machine, looking up at him with a soft, genuine warmth that still made my heart swell every time I saw it. "You look tired, Garrett," she said, her voice carrying a maternal tenderness I had never heard in the old days. "Sit down. I kept some cold tea in the fridge for you." "I'm fine, Evelyn," Garrett smiled, his voice low and relaxed. Just a long day of brake pads and oil filters, but the walk home actually felt nice today. The air by the river is starting to smell like autumn. He turned to look at me, a quiet, knowing spark in his eyes. He didn't have to say a word. I knew exactly what he was thinking. 6 months ago, we had been running through these streets in a blind, terrified panic, chasing a ticking clock. Now we had all the time in the world. "Walk with me, Zalie," he asked softly. I nodded, sliding my hand into his. As we walked out of the apartment, the steady hum of my mother's sewing machine started up again behind us, a comforting, rhythmic heartbeat that followed us down the creaking wooden stairs. The walk to the old wooden bridge by the river was different now. We didn't rush. We felt the dry leaves crunching beneath our boots, and we watched the orange light of the setting sun reflect off the ripples in the water. There was no desperate math running through our heads, no count of wrinkled dollars, no shadow of an impending deadline. Just the quiet rustle of the wind through the willow trees and the steady, solid weight of Garrett walking right beside me. We reached the old wooden bridge just as the sun began to slip beneath the treeline, painting the sky in deep shades of amber and violet. The river below us was calm, its surface like a dark mirror reflecting the gentle colors of the evening. We leaned against the worn wooden railing, the cool breeze coming off the water brushing against our faces. I looked down at my hand resting on the timber. The silver band caught the fading sunlight, its small diamond casting a quiet, familiar spark. 6 months ago, looking at this ring had filled me with an unbearable pressure, a sharp panic that made my chest ache. Now, it just felt like a natural part of me, as quiet and steady as the river. Garrett looked down at the water, a peaceful smile softening the sharp lines of his face. "You know," he began softly, his voice blending with the gentle rustle of the willow leaves, "sometimes I still see Bobby driving my old sedan past the garage. He painted the hood and fixed the exhaust, but it still makes that same clunky sound when it turns the corner." I turned to him, feeling a sudden protective squeeze in my heart. "Do you miss it, Garrett?" Garrett let out a soft, dry laugh and shook his head. He reached out, gently wrapping his fingers around mine, his thumb tracing the edges of the silver ring. "Not even for a second," he said, looking deeply into my eyes. "A car is just a piece of metal, Zalie. It was only meant to carry me away because I thought there was a better place out there. But standing here with you, looking at how far we've come, I realize I don't need to run anymore. I'm exactly where I want to be." The sincerity in his voice washed over me, melting away the last residual traces of the old fears. We hadn't escaped our town, and we hadn't struck it rich. But we had found something much rarer, a quiet, unshakable peace. I rested my head against Garrett's shoulder, the rough fabric of his flannel shirt warm against my cheek. The quiet hum of the river below us was the only sound in the world. I closed my eyes, letting the memory of the past year drift through my mind. I remembered the cold panic in the diner, the endless counting of wrinkled dollar bills, and the desperate tears in my mother's bedroom. It all felt like a lifetime ago, a distant storm that had finally run out of rain. "Do you remember the night you first gave it to me?" I asked quietly, my voice barely louder than the breeze. Garrett smiled, his chest rising with a deep breath. "Of course, it was right here. I was so nervous. My hands were shaking worse than they do after 10 hours of wrenching. I had spent months saving every single dime from my shifts, thinking that buying this ring was the hardest thing I'd ever have to do." He paused, his gaze softening as he looked down at the silver band on my finger. "But the real work started after we lost it. The real test wasn't saving up to buy it the first time, it was what we did when everything fell apart. It was walking into that pawn shop together, knowing we had nothing but each other." I looked at the ring, then up at Garrett's face. The lines around his eyes were deeper now, carved by months of hard work and sleepless nights, but they were beautiful. They were the marks of a man who had fought for his family and won. "We were so young then," I murmured, a soft laugh escaping my lips. "We thought a promise was something you put in a velvet box and kept safe from the world. We didn't know that a promise is something you have to carry through the mud, over the miles, and through the quiet sacrifices we never planned to make." The last rays of the amber sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, peaceful shadows across the gentle ripples of the river. The cool evening air brushed against us, bringing with it the sweet, earthy scent of late summer. I looked down at the silver band on my left hand, then up at Garrett's calm, steady face. He turned his hand, gently wrapping his fingers through mine, locking our palms together. The silver metal of the ring pressed warmly between our skin. "When we first stood on this bridge," I said softly, my voice carrying a quiet weight, "I thought our future depended entirely on that little velvet box. I thought if we lost it, we lost everything we had built." Garrett looked down at our joined hands, his thumb tracing the back of my knuckles with a gentle, slow rhythm. "And now," I looked back toward the town, where the faint, warm yellow lights of our tiny apartment window were just beginning to flicker on in the twilight. I could picture my mother inside, peacefully sitting at her sewing machine, her hands moving with a quiet confidence we had all fought so hard to restore. We hadn't escaped to a big city, we didn't have a car, and our pockets weren't full of gold. But we had something infinitely more valuable, an unbreakable, quiet peace. I looked back up into Garrett's eyes, a soft, tearful smile spreading across my face. Back then, I thought this ring was our promise, I whispered, the words settling deeply into the quiet space between us. Now I know we were the promise all along. Garrett didn't say a word. He just smiled, leaning down to press a long, gentle kiss against my forehead. As we finally turned to walk back home together through the warm twilight, our steps were slow, deliberate, and perfectly in sync. We had walked through the fire, and we had come out whole.